The first sign was the silence. We didn't understand it then, couldn't have understood it, because silence on a forge world is impossible. Silence means the machines have stopped, and machines never stop, not on a world consecrated to production, not when your planetary tithe is measured in millions of munitions, shells, and thousands of armored vehicles annually. But that morning, 3 weeks after the tithe assessors departed with their ledgers and their condemnations, the great manufactorums along the equatorial belt simply ceased their eternal grinding. No alarms, no explanations broadcast over the planetary Vox network, just silence spreading like a disease through the industrial canyons, creeping into hab blocks where workers had learned to sleep through cacophony, but now woke terrified by its absence. I was a mid-level production coordinator in Manufactorum Sigma 7-4, responsible for tracking output quotas on munitions assembly line 9 Theta, and when I arrived at my station that morning to find the conveyor systems motionless, the servitors standing frozen in their work poses, the great stamping machines silent as tombstones, I felt something in my chest constrict that I would later recognize as the beginning of understanding. We had failed the tithe. We had failed the Imperium. And the Imperium does not forgive. The numbers had been troubling for years, though we'd learned not to speak of such things openly. Sigma Forge 7 was an ancient world, its primary manufactorums dating back 6,000 years to the first wave of imperial expansion into our sector. The machinery was old, temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and prayer rituals to coax into function. Production efficiency had declined gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, a 2% drop one decade, 3% the next. The tech priests of the Mechanicus who oversaw our operations implemented adjustments, ordered longer shifts, reduced rest periods, increased worker quotas. We compensated, we endured, but the tithe demands never decreased, never adjusted for aging infrastructure or depleted resource veins or the simple entropy that afflicts all things given enough time. The administratum's ledgers were inflexible, carved into bureaucratic stone millennia ago. Sigma Forge 7 would provide 47 million artillery shells, 12,000 armored transports, 800,000 LAS rifles, and 17 million units of assorted ordnance annually. These were the numbers. These had always been the numbers. Failure was not accounted for in the ledgers. The assessors had arrived 6 months prior, as they did every 5 years, emerging from a bulk transport that settled into high orbit like a carrion bird claiming a carcass. They descended in shuttles marked with the administratum's eagle and quill, accompanied by armed enforcers and servitor scribes carrying data looms loaded with centuries of production records. I remember watching them process through the main gates of Sigma 7-4, their red robes pristine against our world's perpetual industrial haze, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that made them look like mechanized insects. They spread throughout the manufactorum levels, inspecting, measuring, recording. They reviewed every cogitator log, every shipping manifest, every resource allocation report. They interviewed overseers and tech priests. They observed production lines in operation, timing each stage with chronometers blessed by the Mechanicus. They stayed for 3 weeks. When they departed, they left behind a single document sealed with black wax, the judgment of insufficiency. I never saw the document itself. Such things were reserved for the planetary governor and the senior tech priests, but words spread through the hab blocks like radiation, invisible and poisoning. We had fallen short by 11%. Over the past 5 years, cumulative production had failed to meet tithe requirements by 11%. The number became a mantra, whispered in mess halls and transit tubes, repeated until it lost meaning, until it became just sound, just air vibrating against eardrums. 11%. It seemed so small. Such a minor deviation. Surely the Imperium could absorb this shortage, could adjust, could show mercy to a world that had served faithfully for 6 millennia. We told ourselves this during those 3 weeks between the assessor's departure and the silence. We told ourselves the Imperium was vast, that we were but one world among millions, that 11% was forgivable. We were children whistling past the graveyard, and we didn't even know we were already dead. The silence lasted 4 hours. Then the Vox network crackled to life with a planetary broadcast in High Gothic, translated by servitor speakers into our local dialect. Citizens of Sigma Forge 7, you have been found deficient in your sacred obligations to the God Emperor of mankind. By order of the Administratum, backed by the authority of the Imperial Tithe Office and the mandate of Holy Terror itself, your world enters penance protocol Tertius. Production will cease, resources will be reallocated, population will be reassessed. The Emperor's justice is absolute. The Emperor's mercy is earned through suffering. Accept your penance. Embrace your purification. In the Emperor's name. The message repeated 3 times, then silence returned, heavier now, weighted with comprehension. Penance protocol Tertius. None of us knew what it meant, but the words tasted like ash and iron in my mouth. The first shuttles arrived the next day, descending through our polluted atmosphere in formation, military craft marked with the symbols of the Administratum Enforcers and the Adeptus Arbites. They landed at the primary starport and disgorged thousands of armed personnel, not soldiers in the traditional sense, but bureaucrats with weapons, functionaries authorized to enforce compliance through violence if necessary. They established checkpoints at every major transit hub. They seized control of all Vox communications. They occupied the planetary governor's palace and the Mechanicus Forge temples. Resistance was unthinkable. We were a civilian population, workers and technicians and minor functionaries, unarmed and untrained. More importantly, resistance was heresy. These were imperial authorities acting with imperial mandate. To oppose them was to oppose the Emperor himself. So we did not resist. We complied. We queued at the checkpoints when ordered. We surrendered our identification papers for verification. We waited to be told what penance meant. The food shipments stopped 3 days after the shuttles landed. Sigma Forge 7 was not an agricultural world. We produced weapons, not sustenance. Our food supplies arrived on bulk freighters from agri-worlds in the sector, regular shipments that we'd never questioned, never thought about beyond consuming them. But under penance protocol, all incoming resources were diverted. The freighters no longer came. The vast warehouses that stored our grain and protein paste and vitamin supplements were sealed by Administratum order, their contents confiscated as planetary assets subject to reallocation. We were told that rations would be distributed according to new protocols, that the Emperor provided for those who served, that we need only demonstrate our worthiness through renewed labor. But no labor was permitted. The manufactorums remained silent, the machines dormant. We waited in our hab blocks, and we grew hungry. I lived in a residential tower designated Habstack Gamma 443, a brutalist structure 300 stories tall, housing approximately 50,000 workers and their families. My quarters were on the 112th floor, a small space I shared with my wife Mara and our daughter Ellen, who was 7 years old and had been born knowing nothing but the sound of distant machinery and the smell of promethium exhaust. We had modest savings, enough to purchase supplementary food from local vendors for perhaps 2 weeks. Many families were less fortunate. The first deaths from starvation were reported after 9 days. Old people, mostly, and the very young. The Medicaid facilities were overwhelmed within hours of the first cases, but there was little they could do. You cannot cure hunger with medicine, only with food, and food no longer existed in quantities sufficient to sustain 9 billion souls. The Administratum established distribution centers throughout the hive cities, massive staging areas where citizens could queue for rations. The queues stretched for kilometers, orderly at first because we were an obedient population, trained to forms and procedures. I joined one such queue on the 11th day, leaving before dawn to secure a position, leaving Mara and Ellen in our hab unit, because the fewer people we brought, the faster we might move through processing. The queue snaked through industrial canyons, past silent manufactorums whose windows gaped empty and dark, past checkpoints where Arbites enforcers watched with shotguns held casually across their chests. The people around me were gaunt already, their clothes hanging loose, their eyes developing that hollow quality that comes from too little sustenance and too much fear. We didn't speak much. What was there to say? We shuffled forward in silence, gaining perhaps 10 meters every hour, while the sun tracked across our toxic sky and the temperature climbed toward the daily maximum of 47 degrees. I reached the distribution center after 16 hours. It occupied what had been a cargo loading facility, its vast interior now filled with processing stations manned by administratum functionaries and guarded by enforcers in carapace armor. The stations were arranged in rows, each with a servitor-operated cogitator system and a single functionary reviewing documentation. I presented my identification papers and my family registry documentation when my turn finally came. The functionary was a woman perhaps 30 years old, her face blank with the practiced neutrality of bureaucratic authority. She scanned my papers, consulted her cogitator screen, and stamped a form with a heavy brass seal. Ration allocation. Category tertius. Quantity 1400 calories per person per day. Collection schedule. Every 7th day. Failure to collect on schedule results in forfeiture. The Emperor provides. She handed me a package wrapped in plain brown polymer, sealed with tape marked with Aquila symbols. I took it and left, clutching it against my chest like treasure. And only later did I calculate that 1400 calories per person per day was approximately half what an adult needed to maintain basic function, and less than half what a growing child required. The package contained compressed protein bars, vitamin tablets, and a canteen of water that tasted faintly of rust and chemicals. Mara wept when I returned home, not from relief but from understanding this was not temporary hardship but systematic starvation. A slow execution disguised as rationing. We divided the protein bars carefully, measuring exact portions, and we ate them slowly, trying to make our bodies believe they'd received more than they had. Ellen asked why she was still hungry after eating, and I told her the Emperor was testing us, that if we remained faithful and patient, abundance would return. I was lying. I knew I was lying, but what else could I tell her? That her world had been judged unworthy? That the Imperium had decided 9 billion lives were expendable? That we were being allowed to starve as punishment for failing to produce enough bullets for wars we would never see fought on worlds whose names we would never know? Weeks passed, measured now not in days but in ration collections. Every 7th day, I joined the queues, endured the processing, collected the inadequate packages. The queues grew more desperate as hunger deepened its grip. Fights broke out sometimes, people shoving and screaming over positions, over perceived slights, over nothing at all because starvation makes people crazy, makes them animals. The enforcers responded with shock moles and shotguns loaded with riot rounds, beating the aggressive into compliance, sometimes shooting those who persisted. Bodies were left in the streets as examples, as warnings. And they weren't collected for days because why waste resources on corpses? The smell of decay began to mix with the usual industrial stench, creating a new olfactory signature for our dying world: promethium and rot, chemicals and decomposition, the perfume of penance. The cold came earlier than usual that year. Sigma Forge 7's climate was artificially maintained by the waste heat from our manufactorums, their eternal operation creating a thermal envelope that kept the planet warmer than its distant sun would otherwise allow. But the manufactorums were silent now, producing no heat, and without their constant output, the atmosphere began to cool. Temperatures dropped 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. Our hab blocks had minimal heating systems, designed only to supplement the environmental warmth, and they struggled to compensate. We wore every article of clothing we owned, layered together, and still we shivered. Ellen developed a cough that wouldn't leave, a wet rattling sound that kept Mara and me awake through the long nights. We had no medicine. The Medicae facilities had closed weeks ago, their supplies exhausted, their staff either dead or reassigned. I held my daughter while she coughed and felt her ribs through her clothes, felt how thin she'd become, and I prayed to the Emperor for mercy, for intervention, for anything. The Emperor did not answer. The Emperor never answers. People started burning things for warmth. Furniture first, then books, then the wooden paneling stripped from hab unit walls. The enforcers didn't stop us. They'd received no orders regarding fuel consumption, and in the absence of explicit prohibition, survival impulses were permitted to operate. Our habstack began to smell like smoke constantly, poorly vented fires filling the corridors with haze that made breathing difficult, that made Ellen's cough worse. But the choice was freeze or suffocate, and we chose suffocation because at least it came with warmth. I watched my neighbors transform week by week, their humanity eroding under the pressure of deprivation. We stopped greeting each other in the corridors. We stopped making eye contact. We became ghosts haunting our own lives, waiting for death, too weak to do anything but wait. The riots began in the 3rd month. I wasn't surprised. Desperation has mathematics. Equations that calculate how much suffering a population can endure before social cohesion fractures. We'd reached that threshold. The first riot erupted at a ration distribution center in one of the southern hive cities. Thousands of starving citizens overwhelming the enforcer guards through sheer numbers, breaching the warehouses, seizing the stored food. The response was swift and absolute. Arbeits units arrived with armored vehicles and heavy weapons. They didn't attempt crowd control or non-lethal dispersal. They simply opened fire with heavy bolters and flamers, killing everyone in the facility and the surrounding blocks. Thousands dead in minutes. Their bodies left burning as an example. The planetary Vox network broadcast footage of the massacre with a simple message. This is the price of disorder. This is the reward of heresy. Accept your penance. The Emperor judges. More riots followed despite the massacre. Or perhaps because of it, when death is certain whether you comply or rebel. Rebellion at least offers the possibility of dying with a full stomach. Each riot was crushed with the same brutal efficiency. The Arbeits had infinite ammunition and no compunction about using it. They killed tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and the bodies were left where they fell because disposing of them would require resources better allocated elsewhere. The streets of our hive cities became charnel grounds, corpses piled against buildings, rotting where they lay because it was too cold for rapid decomposition, but warm enough that the process continued, just slowly, releasing gases that made the air taste sweet and rotten. I stopped going outside except for ration collection. I couldn't bear to see the bodies, to step around them, to acknowledge them as human beings who had once lived and hoped and loved. Better to stay inside, to huddle with my family, to count the days between rations and try not to think about what would happen when my body finally consumed the last of its reserves. Mara died in the 4th month. She'd been giving Ellen portions of her own rations for weeks, insisting she wasn't hungry, that she'd eaten while I was out collecting supplies. I knew she was lying, but I didn't stop her because what father wouldn't let his wife sacrifice herself for their daughter? What husband would forbid that terrible love? She simply didn't wake up one morning, her body finally exhausted of everything it needed to continue functioning. I held her for an hour, her skin already cooling in the unheated hab unit, and I couldn't even cry because my body didn't have enough water to spare for tears. Ellen asked if Mommy was sleeping, and I said yes, she's sleeping, she's very tired, and we need to let her rest. I don't know if Ellen believed me. 7-year-olds understand death better than we give them credit for, especially 7-year-olds who've watched their world die around them. I should have reported Mara's death to the administratum. There were procedures for death registration, forms to be filed, identity papers to be surrendered. But reporting her death meant losing her ration allocation, and Ellen needed those calories. So, I kept Mara's body in our hab unit, wrapped in sheets, positioned by the window where the cold air would slow decomposition. I kept her identification papers. I kept collecting her rations. I became a criminal in the eyes of Imperial law, a thief stealing from the Emperor's stores, and I didn't care because my daughter was still breathing, and I would commit any heresy necessary to keep her breathing a little longer. The cannibalism started in the 5th month. Though no one spoke of it openly, you would see evidence in the way certain people looked healthier than possible given the ration allocations, in the way bodies left in the streets would be missing portions when you passed them again, in the vendors who appeared in dark corners, offering protein supplements that didn't bear close examination. The Arbeits didn't intervene. Cannibalism wasn't explicitly prohibited under penance protocol, and in fact it solved a disposal problem. So the authorities looked away while the dying ate the dead. I never participated. I told myself this was principle, that I retained some shred of humanity. But truthfully, it was just cowardice. I couldn't overcome the revulsion, couldn't force my hands to do what my mind understood was logical, so Ellen and I continued to starve slowly while others found temporary survival in atrocity. The change came in the 6th month, though we didn't recognize it as change at first, just as a new layer of horror added to existing horror. Shuttles began arriving at the starport again, dozens of them, disgorging not enforcers but labor crews and cargo haulers. They came to the manufactorums, the silent buildings we'd thought abandoned, and they began dismantling them. Not repairing, dismantling. They removed the great machines piece by piece, loaded them onto cargo haulers, lifted them into orbit where bulk transports waited to carry them elsewhere. They stripped our world of its productive capacity, harvested the machinery like organs from a body, left only empty shells where mighty manufactorums had stood. We watched this from our hab blocks, too weak to do anything but watch, and we understood finally what penance protocol truly meant. We had failed the tithe. Therefore, we were no longer useful. Therefore, we would be liquidated, our assets redistributed, our population allowed to expire. The Imperium was not punishing us. The Imperium was writing us off, deleting a line from the ledger. Moving on. The water stopped running in the 7th month. The desalination plants that processed our world's limited surface water had required constant power, which had come from the manufactorums, which were now silent and partially dismantled. Without power, without maintenance, the plants failed. The reservoirs emptied. The pipes went dry. Our ration collections stopped, including water canteens. We were told to collect moisture from atmospheric condensation, to boil and purify whatever we could find. But our world was a desert planet beneath its industrial overlay, with minimal precipitation, and what little water existed was contaminated by millennia of industrial pollution. People died of thirst more quickly than they died of starvation, their bodies dehydrating in days, tongues swelling, skin cracking, minds breaking. I found a maintenance access to an old coolant recycling system beneath our hab stack, a trickle of liquid that tasted like metal and chemicals but was wet, and I collected it in containers, boiled it over our furniture fires, and gave it to Ellen drop by drop. She was skeletal now, her eyes enormous in her skull, her breathing shallow, her cough constant. But she was alive. She was still alive. The 8th month brought the final ships. These were not cargo haulers but prison transports, grim vessels designed to move human cattle in bulk. The administratum announced that selected citizens would be relocated to labor worlds where they could work off their world's tithe debt through service. This was presented as mercy, as opportunity, as the Emperor's grace giving us chance at redemption. Lists were posted at the distribution centers, identification numbers selected for transport. My number was on the list. Ellen's was not. The selection criteria were opaque, probably random, possibly based on factors like age and projected labor capacity. I was 34 years old, still capable of work despite the starvation. Ellen was 7, frail, sick, not economically viable. The lists were non-negotiable. Report for transport or be designated as resistant and shot. I made a decision that I will carry until I die, and beyond if there is any existence beyond death. I left Ellen in our hab unit with Mara's body and 3 days of rations, and I reported for transport. I told her I would return for her, that I would fix everything, that she just needed to be brave for a little while longer. She nodded, too weak to cry, too far gone to really understand. I held her one last time, feeling the bird-bone fragility of her body, and then I left. I walked away from my daughter, and I boarded a transport ship, and I let them carry me away from that dying world. I told myself I was being realistic, that there was no way to take her with me, that at least this way I might survive, might somehow send help, might somehow return. These were lies. The truth is I was a coward. The truth is I chose my own survival over hers. The truth is I abandoned my child to die alone in the cold and dark, and no amount of rationalization changes that fact. The transport took 3 months to reach its destination. a mining world in a neighboring sector where labor needs exceeded local population capacity. We were packed into cargo holds, 800 people per hold designed for 300. No amenities, minimal rations, one sanitation station per hold that backed up constantly. A quarter of the prisoners died during transit disease, mostly infections spreading through our weakened bodies, consuming us in our crowded darkness. The dead were processed through recycling units that reduced them to component materials, their molecules repurposed as protein paste to feed the living. The Imperium wastes nothing. The Imperium is efficient above all else. I worked in the mines for 3 years, deep excavations extracting radioactive ore used in promethium refinement. The labor was brutal, the conditions lethal, the life expectancy measured in months, but I survived because I was already dead inside, already a ghost, and ghosts are hard to kill. I worked my shifts, met my quotas, avoided attention. I received no news from Sigma Forge 7 because Sigma Forge 7 no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The Administratum had reclassified it as a dead world, its manufactorum stripped, its population liquidated, its tithe obligation transferred to other worlds. I don't know when Ellen died. Probably within days of my departure, possibly within hours. Maybe she's still technically alive somewhere, sold to a servitor conversion facility, her brain scooped out and replaced with programming, her body modified into a machine slave. I don't know which possibility is worse. After 3 years, my labor debt was declared satisfied. This was unusual. Most tithe debtors worked until death, but the mining world's overseers needed to clear space for new arrivals, and I demonstrated consistent performance, so they processed my release documentation and transferred me to a civilian transit hub where I could seek employment elsewhere. I was free, technically, to go anywhere, to do anything. I had survived my world's failure. I had endured the penance. I was alive when billions were dead. I should have felt grateful, blessed, fortunate. Instead, I felt nothing. The place where emotions had lived was empty now, excavated as thoroughly as the mines I'd worked. I found employment eventually as a production coordinator again, this time on an agri-world where my manufactorum experience translated adequately to managing harvest processing. I work, I eat, I sleep, I continue existing because stopping would require effort, and I have no effort to spare. Sometimes I think about Ellen, about whether she suffered at the end, whether she understood that I'd abandoned her, whether she forgave me. Probably she was too far gone to think anything coherent by the time the end came. Probably she just stopped, her tiny body finally admitting defeat, and she ceased to exist as a conscious entity and became just meat, just cooling flesh in a hab unit full of corpses. This is the kindest possibility. I hope she got the kindest possibility. No one speaks about Sigma Forge 7. The planetary failure was noted in Administratum records. The tithe obligations redistributed, and the galaxy moved on. 9 billion people died to correct an 11% shortfall, and it didn't matter, made no impact on the Imperium's vast machinery. There are millions of worlds. Losing one is acceptable. Liquidating its population is regrettable but necessary. The alternative would be accepting failure, admitting that tithe demands might be unrealistic, acknowledging that the system might be flawed, and these admissions are impossible because the system is built on absolute certainty. The Imperium cannot doubt itself. Therefore, the failure must be ours. Therefore, the punishment is just. Therefore, 9 billion deaths are righteous correction rather than bureaucratic atrocity. I've been working on this agri-world for 4 years now. I'm 38 years old and I look 60, my body aged prematurely by starvation and radiation and guilt. I live alone in a small hab unit that I keep meticulously clean, as if cleanliness might wash away memory. I perform my duties with adequate competence, maintaining the standards expected of a mid-level functionary. I attend the mandatory religious services where we praise the Emperor's mercy and wisdom. I recite the litanies. I make the proper gestures. I am, by all external measures, a functioning member of Imperial society. No one knows what I did. No one knows what I am. Sometimes, in the depths of the night cycle when sleep won't come, I calculate the mathematics of failure. Sigma Forge 7 needed to produce an additional 11% output over 5 years to meet its tithe. That equals approximately 220% additional production annually, which with adjusted labor schedules and resource allocation might have been achievable. Maybe if we'd worked longer hours, accepted lower rations earlier, sacrificed more of our population to servitor conversion to increase efficiency. Maybe if we'd stripped our hab blocks for raw materials, burned our historical records for fuel, cannibalized our own infrastructure to feed the machines. Maybe, if we'd transformed every aspect of our existence into pure production, made ourselves into living tools with no thought beyond quota fulfillment, we might have satisfied the tithe. We would have been less than human, but we would have been alive. We chose to remain human just slightly too long, to retain just enough individuality and dignity that we couldn't quite meet the demands, and that choice killed 9 billion people. But this calculation assumes the tithe was achievable. That 11% was a solvable problem rather than inevitable outcome of impossible demands applied to aging infrastructure. This assumption might be false. The administratum's quotas are set based on historical production, adjusted for bureaucratic factors that may or may not reflect current reality. They don't account for entropy, for exhaustion, for the simple wearing down that affects all things. They assume eternal consistency, infinite sustainability, mechanical perfection applied to biological systems. They demand what cannot be given and punish failure to achieve the impossible. This is the true horror of imperial tithes, not that they're harsh, but that they're indifferent to possibility. The quotas exist independent of capability. Failure to meet them is not practical problem but moral failing. Therefore, punishment is not corrective but righteous. I wonder sometimes how many worlds have failed their tithes, how many populations have been liquidated for insufficient production, for bureaucratic shortfalls, for mistakes in reporting or unfortunate timing or simple bad luck. The Imperium encompasses millions of worlds and has endured for 10,000 years. The mathematics suggest thousands of failures at minimum, possibly tens of thousands. Billions of people sacrificed to maintain quotas, to preserve the appearance of system functionality, to avoid admitting that the demands might exceed capacity. We think of imperial might in terms of armies and fleets and superhuman warriors, but the true foundation is this: the willingness to destroy populations for failing to meet arbitrary standards, to liquidate assets rather than adjust expectations, to make examples that ensure compliance through terror. This is not strength. This is not protection. This is murder sanctified by scale, genocide disguised as administration. But I continue serving. I continue existing within the system. What else is there? The Imperium is universal within human space. There is nowhere to run, no alternative to embrace, no rebellion that wouldn't be crushed instantly and used as justification for further brutality. The system is self-perpetuating, self-justifying, vast beyond comprehension. Individual resistance is meaningless. Individual suffering is irrelevant. You can only choose whether to be victim or accomplice, whether to die screaming or die complicit. I chose complicity. I chose survival. I walked away from my daughter, and I participated in my own continuation. And every breath I take is theft from those who deserved life more than I do. The agri-world where I work will face its own tithe assessment eventually. The crop yields have been declining slightly, stressed by climate shifts and soil depletion. Nothing dramatic yet, nothing that affects current production significantly, but the trend is concerning. I see the younger workers, the ones who don't remember anything except this world, and I wonder if I should warn them. Tell them what happens when you fail. Tell them that mercy is not coming, that forgiveness is impossible, that the Imperium will liquidate them as casually as discarding broken equipment. But I say nothing. What would be the point? They couldn't change anything. Knowing wouldn't help them. It would only poison their remaining time with dread, and why inflict that cruelty when ignorance offers at least the comfort of false hope? I think about Elin constantly. Not productively, just circular thoughts that accomplish nothing, change nothing, just wear grooves in my mind, like water eroding stone. I imagine the moment she realized I wasn't coming back. The betrayal in her eyes, if she was still conscious enough for betrayal, the cold and hunger consuming her in that empty hab unit. I imagine her small body curled next to Mara's corpse, seeking warmth from death, waiting for rescue that would never arrive. I imagine the exact moment her heart stopped beating, her brain ceased processing, her consciousness extinguished like a candle flame in vacuum. These images are my penance, my eternal punishment, more effective than any torture the Inquisition might devise. I carry them always. I will carry them until my own death, and probably beyond if there's any justice in the universe. But there isn't justice. That's the final truth, the one I've learned at the cost of everything I loved. The Imperium doesn't operate on justice. It operates on scale and necessity and the mathematics of empire. Justice requires individual consideration, nuanced judgment, acknowledgement of context. These things are impossible when you're managing millions of worlds and quadrillions of people. Instead, you have quotas and protocols and binary outcomes, compliance or liquidation, success or elimination, utility or disposal. There's an efficiency to this system, a brutal logic that works if you're capable of not seeing the people being processed through it. The administratum functionaries who condemned Sigma Forge 7 probably never visited our world, never saw our faces, never considered us as individuals. We were a line on a ledger, a production shortfall, a statistical deviation requiring correction. They made their calculations and filed their reports, and moved on to the next world, and 9 billion people died. And it was all proper, and documented, and authorized. The Emperor protects. We say this constantly, ritual phrase worn smooth by repetition, but protects from what? Not from hunger, not from cold, not from bureaucratic liquidation, not from dying alone in the dark while your father chooses his own life over yours. The phrase is meaningless, or perhaps its meaning is darker than we acknowledge. The Emperor protects the Imperium, the system, the structure. Individuals are expendable, worlds are replaceable. What matters is continuation, eternal persistence of the machinery, and if that machinery requires regular feeding of human lives to function, then that feeding is holy. We are not protected. We are fuel. I will continue working until I die. This is my fate, my purpose, my punishment. I will process harvests and maintain quotas and file reports and attend services and recite litanies and never tell anyone what I know, what I've done, what I've lost. I will be a functional cog in the infinite machine, rotating in place, wearing down slowly, eventually breaking and being replaced. When I die from industrial accident or simple exhaustion or one of the 1,000 ways minor functionaries cease existing, they'll process my body through recycling, extract useful materials, dispose of waste, and assign my identification number to someone else. I will leave no mark. I will be forgotten completely. This is appropriate. This is deserved. But before I go, before my consciousness extinguishes, I need to testify to this. The Imperial Tithe system is not just, not proportional, not survivable. It kills worlds. It liquidates populations. It transforms mercy into cruelty and duty into genocide. And every citizen of the Imperium participates in this system, either as victim or accomplice, either dying or killing, because there are no other roles available. We are all guilty. We are all condemned. We are all waiting our turn to fail the quota, to fall short of the demand, to be found insufficient and erased. This is what it means to live in the Imperium. This is what the Emperor's protection actually entails: not safety, but systematic brutality, not grace but grinding certainty of eventual destruction. When your planet fails its tithe, they let you starve. They strip your world of anything useful. They abandon your population to die slowly, without mercy, without help, alone in the dark and cold. 9 billion people become 0 people over the course of 8 months, and this is considered normal, acceptable, necessary. The mathematics of empire require it, the quotas demand it, the system perpetuates it, and those of us who survive carry the knowledge forward, carry the guilt forward, carry the truth forward even though we cannot speak it, even though speaking it would accomplish nothing. I abandoned my daughter to save myself. I walked away and let her die. This is the price of my survival, the cost of my continuation. I am alive, and she is ash. And there is no redemption for this, no forgiveness possible, no restoration available. I can only continue existing, continue serving, continue participating in the system that killed her, and killed billions, and will kill billions more, because the alternative is admitting that the Emperor's Imperium is built on genocide, and that admission would shatter the foundations of everything we pretend to believe. So I work. And I remember. And I wait for my own failure, my own liquidation, my own erasure. It will come eventually. For everyone. Eventually, it comes. The tithe always comes due, and the Imperium always collects, and mercy is just a word we use to make murder sound holy. The Emperor protects. The Emperor does not protect. Both statements are equally true, equally meaningless, equally impossible to reconcile. This is the paradox at the heart of Imperial faith. This is the truth behind the tithes. This is what I learned on Sigma Forge 7, and what I will carry until consciousness finally, mercifully, ends.